I was only 17 years old when the hands that were supposed to protect me closed around my neck. In broad daylight, in front of classmates and teachers, I felt life slipping away while I saw the cold stare of my own parents. The October air in Washington was freezing, but not as cold as the determination I saw in the eyes of the man who brought me into this world. And the most shocking part, this scene didn't happen in some lost village in the Middle East, nor in some isolated rural region where law enforcement hadn't yet reached. It happened in Washington, United States, in the heart of Western democracy. The video of the attack went viral on social media within hours, showing the entire world that cruel traditions can cross oceans, cross borders, and destroy lives anywhere on the planet. The shaky images captured by a cell phone revealed a disturbing truth. Violence in the name of honor knows no geography. It doesn't respect passports, visas, or green cards. It travels silently in the luggage of families who, to outside eyes, simply appear to be immigrants pursuing the American dream. But for me, Layla, the American dream turned into a nightmare when I dared to dream of freedom, when I decided that my life belonged to me, when I chose to run away instead of accepting an arranged marriage that would define my entire future, without me having a right to a single word. Prepare yourself to hear a story that goes beyond a police case. It's a raw portrait of how the clash between ancestral traditions and modern freedoms can cost lives, and how sometimes surviving is just the beginning of a long journey in search of justice. My name is Layla. I'm 17 years old and I live in Washington, in the heart of the United States. But my story doesn't look anything like that of many American teenagers you know from movies or TV shows. I don't have a prom marked on my calendar. I can't choose my clothes freely, and I never had a first romantic date. Before continuing, if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, check if the notification bell is activated. And write in the comments how far this story is reaching. I want to know if my voice, even hurt and still recovering, can reach you on the other side of the screen. Because maybe you know someone like me. Maybe you are someone like me. I was born into a family that came to the United States when I was little. My parents brought in their luggage not only clothes and documents, but also a rigid set of rules about how a daughter should behave. Rules that, according to them, would guarantee my safety and honor. Rules that, to me, seemed like invisible prisons. I grew up hearing that women from our culture are like precious diamonds. They should be kept, protected, maintained pure until the right moment. But at 17, I began to ask myself, protected from what exactly? From life, from choices, from happiness? When my schoolmates talked about college plans, about careers they wanted to pursue, about places they dreamed of visiting, I felt a pang in my chest. It wasn't envy. It was longing for a future I would never have permission to dream about, and it was this longing that planted in me the seed of a decision that would change everything. A decision that almost cost me my life, but also showed me what I was capable of when I fought for my own existence. I grew up in a house where silence weighed more than words. Each step was measured by tradition, each gesture observed through the lens of a code of honor that had crossed centuries to reach our living room in Washington. Since I was little, I heard that one day I would be given in marriage. It didn't matter what I dreamed for myself. It didn't matter what talents I discovered. It didn't matter the brightness my teachers saw in my eyes when I talked about literature or science. The house where I grew up was a microcosm of two cultures in conflict. Outside, American neighbors mowed their lawns on weekends, organized backyard barbecues, and let their teenage children go out with friends. Inside, the rules were different. I couldn't wear certain clothes, I couldn't go out alone, I couldn't have male friends, and mainly, I couldn't question. When I turned 17, the pressure intensified. My father began talking openly about finding a good husband for me. These weren't suggestions or conversations about the future. They were concrete plans, negotiations that happened without my participation. I discovered that my life was being auctioned off in conversations that took place in the living room while I washed dishes in the kitchen. The decisive moment came on a September afternoon when my father announced that he had already chosen my future, an arranged marriage with a man 20 years older, which would guarantee honor for the family and financial stability for everyone. The potential groom was successful, respected in the community, and a detail my father considered advantageous, lived in another state, which meant I would move far away. My heart filled with a fear I had never felt before. It wasn't fear of imaginary monsters or abstract situations. It was the concrete terror of seeing my entire life being defined by other people. I wanted to study. I dreamed of a career. I imagined myself one day working as a journalist or teacher, but each day I felt the circle closing in, the walls of the house closing like a trap about to shut definitively. It was then that I began planning something that would change my life forever. During school breaks, I researched shelters for young people, legal emancipation, organizations that helped girls in similar situations, and slowly, very slowly, I began to trace an escape plan that would require all the courage I could muster. But what I didn't know was that my attempt to escape would be discovered and punished in the most brutal way possible, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, recorded on video for the entire world to see. That October 2024, I woke up knowing I couldn't spend another day pretending to accept the destiny they had chosen for me. The wedding date was approaching, preparations had already begun, and I could feel my freedom slipping away like sand through my fingers. That's when I made the most courageous and risky decision of my life. I would run away. The plan was simple but required perfect timing. For weeks I had been hiding small amounts of money, a few dollars from lunch money here, some coins found in the couch there. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for a few days. I took only the essentials, some clothes, personal documents, and hid my cell phone in my jacket pocket, knowing it would be my only line of communication with the outside world. Leaving the house was the most terrifying moment. Each creak of the wooden floor seemed like an alarm. Each breath sounded too loud, but I managed to reach the front door without waking anyone. The cold Washington dawn air welcomed me with a promise of freedom I had never felt before. I was thinking of asking for help from an aunt who had always quietly questioned the family's rigid methods. This aunt, my mother's younger sister, had married an American and adopted a more liberal lifestyle. I knew it would be risky. The family could pressure her to turn in her niece, but I didn't have many options. For some precious weeks, I believed I was safe. I slept on my aunt's couch, helped with household chores in exchange for shelter, and for the first time in my life experienced the sensation of making small but significant choices. What clothes to wear, what TV program to watch, what book to read before bed. They were tiny freedoms, but for me, they represented a new world. During this period, I tried to maintain minimal contact with school so as not to raise suspicions. I invented a story about visiting relatives, but I knew I couldn't maintain the lie for much longer. What I didn't know was that my parents had already discovered my whereabouts through the community contact network. Living in hiding requires more than courage. It requires luck, resources, and a solid support network. And I was beginning to realize that I had only the first of these three things. Unfortunately, luck was about to run out in a dramatic and violent way. The reunion with my parents wouldn't happen within the safety of a home, with mediation or conversations. It would happen in a public place, in front of dozens of witnesses, in a way that would mark forever not only me but everyone who witnessed the scene. It was an ordinary autumn morning in Washington. Golden leaves covered the school courtyard. Students walked lazily carrying heavy backpacks, and the normal sound of morning conversations filled the air. I had decided to return to classes. Staying away for too long would raise suspicions, and I still needed to finish high school, even though my future was uncertain. What I didn't know was that my parents had spent days planning that moment. They had discovered my hiding place, mapped my routine, and chosen the location of the confrontation with calculated precision. The school represented, in their eyes, the epicenter of my corruption, the place where I had learned Western ideas about freedom and independence. When I got off the school bus, I immediately realized something was wrong. My parents were there, standing near the main gate, with expressions I knew well, a mixture of contained rage and cold determination. My first instinct was to run, but where? The courtyard was full of people, and I knew that any attempt to flee would only delay the inevitable. That's when I heard my father's voice cutting through the morning air. "Layla, you're going home now. Immediately." The voice carried all the authority he had always exercised over me, but this time something had changed. I didn't lower my eyes. I didn't nod submissively. Instead, I took a step back. "I'm not going," I replied, and my own words surprised me. It was the first time in my life I had said no directly to my father. Classmates around began to notice that something was happening. Conversations stopped, looks turned to our family, and some students discreetly began taking out their phones. What happened next was quick and brutal. My father advanced, grabbed me by the arms with enough force to leave marks, and tried to drag me toward the car. I screamed, struggled, asked for help. My mother joined my father not to protect me but to help contain me, and that's when his hands closed around my neck. Witnesses recorded the exact moment when I began struggling to breathe. Panic took over the school courtyard. Some students ran for help, others were paralyzed by shock, and a few brave ones began shouting and approaching, trying to intervene. The video captured everything. The desperation in my eyes, the relentless determination of my parents, and the horror of an entire school community realizing they were witnessing an attempted murder. The shaky cell phone images showed what appeared to be an execution in progress, but there was still something no one expected, a twist that would divide opinions and save a life. Physical education teacher Marcus Thompson was the first adult to react. An Army veteran with more than 15 years of experience dealing with crisis situations, he didn't hesitate. He dropped the sports equipment he was carrying and ran toward the commotion, shouting for others to call the police. Along with him, two brave students, Sarah Martinez, 18, and David Chen, 17, advanced without thinking about possible consequences. The moment of intervention was chaotic. Marcus tried to separate my father from me using containment techniques he had learned in the Army, while Sarah held my mother's arm, preventing her from continuing to help immobilize me. David, in turn, began shouting for other students to call an ambulance, realizing that I was losing consciousness rapidly. My parents' resistance was fierce. My father, in a burst of rage, pushed Marcus and shouted something in our native language that witnesses couldn't understand, but which were clearly threats. My mother, in tears, alternated between trying to help her husband and begging me to stop resisting and come home. It was a surreal scene, a woman who loved her daughter, but who had internalized traditional values so much that she couldn't see she was participating in an attempted murder. The police arrived in less than 5 minutes, alerted by multiple emergency calls. The officers found a scene that no training could have completely prepared them for: a semi-unconscious teenager on the ground, hysterical parents trying to justify their actions, dozens of traumatized students, and several videos being recorded simultaneously that were already beginning to circulate on social media. I was immediately treated by paramedics. The marks on my neck were visible and shocking, purple bruises that told a clear story of attempted strangulation. I was conscious, but confused, repeatedly whispering, "I don't want to get married. I don't want to get married," while being placed on the stretcher. While the ambulance drove away with me, my parents were detained. My father resisted arrest, still insisting he was just disciplining his daughter and that no one had the right to interfere in family matters. My mother, on the other hand, had an emotional breakdown, alternating between uncontrolled sobs and pleas for someone to explain to her husband that they were in the United States now, where things were different. The video was already going viral on the internet, accumulating thousands of views and hundreds of indignant comments. The hashtag Dr. Justice for Layla began appearing on Twitter, and human rights organizations were already being contacted by journalists wanting to understand the cultural context behind the attack. But while I was being treated, and the world was beginning to discover my story, a crucial question hung in the air. Would American justice treat this as a common crime of attempted murder or as a family case with cultural mitigating factors? The answer would define not only my parents' future, but also send a message about how American society deals with conflicts between cultural traditions and individual rights. At the Washington hospital, I underwent a battery of tests that methodically documented the violence I had suffered. The marks on my neck were evident and alarming, dark bruises that revealed the force applied during the strangulation. Doctors also found abrasions on my arms where I had been grabbed, and signs of extreme stress that indicated the psychological impact of the attack. But the greatest pain wasn't physical. It was the devastating emotional pain of understanding that my own parents, the people who should protect me above all else, saw me as an enemy, a source of shame that needed to be silenced. During the first days of hospitalization, I oscillated between periods of absolute silence and crying fits that seemed to have no end. The case gained international attention almost immediately. The video of the attack was reproduced by news channels worldwide, always accompanied by debates about honor crimes, women's rights, and the challenges of immigration in multicultural societies. I, still recovering in the hospital, had to deal not only with personal trauma, but also with public exposure of my most intimate pain. Psychologists specialized in trauma were called to evaluate my mental state. They found an intelligent, articulate young woman, but deeply shaken by family betrayal. "It's a unique form of trauma," explained Dr. Sarah Williams, a domestic violence specialist who followed the case. When the aggressors are the parents themselves, the victim loses not only physical security, but also the fundamental emotional base, trust in family. Amid headlines and television debates, voices began to rise questioning fundamental aspects of society. To what extent can cultural traditions justify violence? How should a democracy deal with practices that violate basic human rights when they are rooted in deep religious or cultural beliefs? And mainly, how to protect young people like me without falling into prejudices against entire communities. Feminist organizations mobilized in support of me, offering legal and emotional support. At the same time, some voices within the Muslim community itself were divided. While many vehemently condemned the violence, others argued that media exposure of the case was fueling Islamophobia and harming the image of law-abiding immigrant families. I, still in the hospital, had to make a decision that no teenager should face: testify against my own parents in a criminal trial. The decision wasn't just legal. It was emotional, cultural, and would define how I would see myself for the rest of my life. Would I be a brave daughter fighting for justice, or a traitor who destroyed her own family? The answer would come in court, where I would have to find the strength to confront not only my aggressors, but also my own internal contradictions about love, family, tradition, and freedom. Months after the attack, the Washington courthouse became the stage for one of the most watched cases of the year. Journalists from national and international outlets crowded the hallways, cameras captured every movement, and human rights experts offered real-time analysis for news programs. The case had transcended a simple attempted murder to become a symbol of the clash between cultures. My father and mother were in the defendant's dock, but their postures couldn't have been more different. My father maintained an expression of wounded dignity, as if he were the victim of a monumental injustice. Dressed in his best suit, he occasionally whispered to his lawyer, but never looked directly at me when I entered the room. My mother, on the other hand, was visibly destroyed. She had lost weight. Her eyes were constantly red from crying, and she rocked gently in her chair, a movement that psychologists present interpreted as a form of self-comfort in the face of profound emotional trauma. For her, the trial wasn't just about legal guilt, but about the complete disintegration of her family. The defense had built its strategy around the idea of cultural shock, alleging that my parents were victims of a misunderstanding, people who came from a culture where family discipline was viewed differently and who never had the real intention of hurting me. The lawyer argued that it was a desperate attempt to save the family's honor in a society they didn't completely understand. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, had a radically different view. For her, attempted murder was attempted murder, regardless of cultural motivations. Traditions are not above American law, she declared in her opening statement, and especially traditions are not above a young woman's fundamental right to life and liberty. The trial revealed disturbing details about family dynamics. Community witnesses reported that my parents' controlling behavior was nothing new. There were reports of me being prevented from participating in school activities, having my communications monitored, and being constantly reminded that my purity determined the honor of the entire family. But there was also undeniable evidence: the video of the attack, which was played multiple times during the trial, always causing heavy silence in the room. Eyewitnesses who described in detail the moment they saw a teenager struggling to breathe while her own father tried to strangle her. And mainly, the medical reports that documented injuries consistent with attempted murder by asphyxiation. The most anticipated moment of the trial was approaching: my own testimony. It would be the first time I would speak publicly about the attack, and everyone knew that my words could define not only my parents' conviction, but also the future of similar cases in American justice. The day of my testimony was marked by palpable tension in the courtroom. The room was packed beyond capacity, with people sitting on corridor floors, trying to hear through partially open doors. When I entered, wearing a discreet blazer with my hair pulled back, the silence was absolute. At 17 years old, I carried on my shoulders the weight of representing not only my own fight for justice, but the voice of thousands of young people in similar situations around the world. My voice trembled at first, but gradually became firmer as I described the years of control, veiled threats, and constant fear that defined my family life. I loved my parents, I said, looking directly at the jury, but that love became my prison. They believed that controlling me was protecting me, but they were actually killing me slowly, long before they put their hands on my neck. The defense attorney tried to destabilize me during cross-examination, suggesting that I was being influenced by American values that didn't respect parental authority. "Don't you think your parents had the right to worry about your future?" he asked. My response cut like a blade. They had the right to worry. They didn't have the right to try to kill me. But the most impactful moment came when I looked directly at my father for the first time since the attack. For months, I had avoided his gaze, always focusing on the judge, jury, or lawyers. But at that moment, with the entire room watching, I turned to the man who raised me and who almost killed me. "You are a disgusting monster," I said, my voice clear and firm, echoing in every corner of the courtroom. The words were simple, but carried the weight of a lifetime of fear and submission finally broken. "You taught me that parents protect children, but you tried to kill me because I wanted to choose my own life. That's not protection. That's not love. That's what monsters do." The room fell into absolute silence. Some people in the back began crying discreetly. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notepads, knowing they had witnessed a historic moment. My father, who throughout the entire trial had maintained a posture of wounded dignity, seemed to break for the first time. His face contorted, and for a brief moment it seemed he finally understood the magnitude of what he had done. My mother sobbed loudly, covering her face with her hands. For her, hearing me call them monsters was perhaps more painful than any sentence she could receive. It was final confirmation that she had lost her daughter forever, not to American society, not to external influences, but to her own violent choices. My emotionally devastating testimony seemed to have sealed my parents' fate. But the conviction that would follow would surprise everyone and divide opinions about whether justice had truly been served. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with a verdict that would shock human rights advocates and criminal justice experts. The silence was deafening as the jury foreman stood up to read the decision that would define not only my family's future, but also establish a precedent for similar cases. "We find the defendant guilty of aggravated assault and false imprisonment," declared the jury foreman. The most serious charge, attempted murder, had not been accepted. The jury had decided that, although my parents' actions were criminal and traumatic, there wasn't sufficient evidence of intent to kill. It was a legal distinction that made all the difference in sentencing. The final verdict was announced by the judge a week later. Father, sentenced to 20 months in prison for aggravated assault and false imprisonment, followed by 2 years of probation and mandatory therapy. Mother, sentenced to less than 1 year in prison for complicity and violation of a court order, with possibility of parole in 6 months for good behavior. The reaction was immediate and divided. In the courtroom, my supporters expressed disbelief and outrage. 20 months for trying to strangle your own daughter," shouted a women's rights activist. "This is a license for domestic violence." Sentences considered absurdly lenient for such a brutal crime dominated newspaper headlines the next day. Criminal law experts called the sentence dangerously lenient, arguing that it sent a concerning message about how the American judicial system treats culture-based violence. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh expressed her frustration at a press conference. "This sentence doesn't reflect the gravity of the trauma inflicted on Layla, nor the premeditated nature of the attack. We are considering an appeal for sentence review." She made sure to emphasize that cultural differences could never justify physical violence. On the other hand, the defense attorney declared partial victory, arguing that the jury had understood the complex circumstances of the case. "My clients are not violent criminals," he declared. "They are parents who reacted inappropriately to an extremely challenging cultural situation. The sentence reflects this reality." Civil rights organizations began questioning whether factors like cultural bias or lack of understanding about the severity of honor crimes had influenced both the jury and the judge. The echoing question was disturbing. If I were a white American teenager attacked by her parents, would the sentence be the same? Public outrage took hold. Online petitions demanding sentence review collected hundreds of thousands of signatures within days. The hashtag #Justice for Layla returned to worldwide trending, this time with a specific focus on the inadequacy of the punishment. For me, the sentence represented a second betrayal. "I survived my parents' attack," I said in an exclusive interview after the trial, "but I feel like the justice system also attacked me. How can they say 20 months is enough for what they did to me?" The decision raised fundamental questions about how democratic societies should balance cultural sensitivity with protection of basic human rights. Law academics began using my case as an example of systemic failures that allow aggressors to receive lenient treatment when their actions can be framed as culturally motivated. But the lenient sentence was just the beginning of a broader legal and social battle that would expose deep flaws in the American justice system. My case tore open a wound that many would prefer to keep hidden. Honor crimes aren't restricted to distant villages or developing countries. They can happen anywhere, even in the heart of the United States, supposedly the land of freedom and equal opportunity. Human rights organizations immediately began using the case as a symbol of a broader battle. UN Women issued an official statement condemning the sentence and asking the United States to review their protocols for gender-based violence cases with cultural components. Layla's case represents thousands of young women around the world who face violence when they dare to claim their autonomy, declared the regional representative. International repercussion was immediate and devastating for the United States' image as a defender of human rights. European newspapers questioned how an advanced democracy could treat attempted femicide with such leniency. If this happened in France or Germany, wrote Le Monde, the perpetrators would face decades in prison, not months. Within the United States, the case exposed deep divisions about immigration, multiculturalism, and the limits of cultural tolerance. Conservative politicians used the case to argue for stricter immigration policies, alleging that allowing entry of people who don't share American values put citizens at risk. Progressives, in turn, argued that the problem wasn't immigration, but the failure of the judicial system to protect victims of domestic violence. But perhaps the most significant repercussion came from within Muslim immigrant communities themselves. Religious leaders from across the country issued statements condemning my parents and clarifying that honor crimes have no basis in true Islam. These are pre-Islamic tribal customs that contradict the Prophet's teachings about respectful treatment of women, explained Imam Abdullah Rahman from Detroit. The Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, launched a national campaign called True Honor to educate communities about the difference between harmful cultural traditions and authentic religious teachings. True honor comes from raising strong and independent daughters, not from controlling them, declared Dr. Yamina Khalil, president of the organization. Universities began including my case in law, sociology, and gender studies curricula. Police training programs were revised to better identify signs of honor-based violence. Women's shelters received special funding for programs targeted at young people from traditional communities. But fear still haunted me, and thousands like me. Threatening letters arrived regularly, some from people who saw me as a traitor to my own culture, others from white supremacists who used my story to justify hatred against Muslims. I had to move addresses 3 times and receive police protection during the first year after the trial. The psychological impact of public exposure added to the trauma of the original attack. I wanted justice, I reflected months later, but I didn't know that would mean living under constant public scrutiny. Sometimes I wonder if it was worth breaking the silence, and while I managed to survive to tell my story and become a symbol of resistance, other young Muslim women weren't as fortunate. Their voices were silenced forever by family violence. My story isn't just about a teenager attacked by her own parents in a school courtyard in Washington. It's about the violent clash between worlds, the world of ancestral traditions that traveled across oceans and centuries, and the world of individual freedoms that promise each person the right to choose their own destiny. 2 years after the attack, I'm in college, studying journalism and human rights. I legally changed my name, cut contact with extended family who condemned me for destroying family honor, and work with organizations that help young people in similar situations. My physical scars have healed, but the emotional ones remain, mainly the pain of knowing that my parents might have preferred to see me dead rather than see me free. I survived, I say, with a mixture of pride and melancholy. But surviving isn't the same as winning. Every day I wake up knowing that somewhere in the world, another girl is going through what I went through, and some of them won't have the luck I had. The case transformed me into a powerful voice against honor crimes, but also isolated me from my cultural roots permanently. It's a high price for freedom, the loss of family, community, and cultural identity, a price many young women aren't willing or prepared to pay. My parents served their reduced sentences and were released. My father was deported to his country of origin after serving 14 months in prison, less than sentence due to good behavior. My mother remains in the United States, but never tried to contact me. According to reports, she lives a reclusive life, working in a textile factory and avoiding any mention of the case that destroyed her family. Justice, in the legal sense, was partially served, but true justice, that which fully recognizes the gravity of the crime and offers adequate reparation to the victim, remains an open question. The system failed to transmit a clear message that culture-based violence will not be tolerated. And if my case shocked you, if the brevity of the sentences outraged you, if my courage inspired you, prepare yourself for what's coming next, because the story we're going to tell in the next episode is even more disturbing. It's about a young woman who didn't have my luck. It's about Aksa Parvez, a 16-year-old Canadian teenager who was strangled to death by her own father because she wanted to wear jeans and remove her hijab. Unlike me, Aksa didn't survive to tell her story, but her murder revealed even more obscure secrets about how honor crimes operate in Western societies and how entire families can conspire to silence a young voice that dares to dream of freedom. The next story isn't about survival, it's about how silence can be more deadly than any weapon, and about how sometimes the death of a young woman can speak louder than her life ever could. Don't miss the next episode, Aksa's Silence, when dreaming of freedom costs your life.